If you are a fan of personality type, Carl Jung, typology, and you don't know Linda Berens, you disgust me, honestly. Linda doesn't know this, but she did have a very profound effect on my growth as a Jung type coach, a type professional. Her workbook, kind of older, but still one of the best ones. I know she has other editions of this. Really, for me, solidified the cognitive function hierarchy and how to crack the type code. I think that's the chapter in the book where it's like, oh, that's how you do it. It's like that's how you do the party trick. Just to, oh, you're an INFJ. Here's the stack. And once I read that, it all made sense. And for that, I'm eternally grateful to Linda. I would say, from my vantage point, I think she's most well known for the Berens interaction styles, which kind of builds on the theory of personality temperaments that goes way back to the ancient Greeks. I hope I said all that right, but Linda, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, you said it right.
Okay. And my apologies in advance. I have known about the interaction styles for a long time, but maybe you can just, for my audience, give a very just brief what they're about, how they evolved.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Happy to do that. So I studied my master's degree with David Kersey, and in the psychopathology class, we had one session, 3-hour session for each of the 4 temperaments, he called them, and the way they go crazy. And then the last 20 minutes was, here's how they look when they're functioning well. Okay, so that was like a whole eye opener, and I discovered my preferences. At that time, he gave us an old mimeographed copy of Form F, the Myers-Briggs. And I discovered I had INTP preferences, but I also related to INFP in the descriptions. So, then from there on out, I got introduced to type, to the Myers-Briggs, or to the Jungian model, through the Association for Psychological Type. David Kersey was there when it was founded. A couple of other, Yves Delunis, Louise Giovannoni was also there as part of the founding group. So temperament was part of that's what I learned first. And then I learned about the type code in the Myers-Briggs, but I later learned about Jung's model and the 8 functions, what's now called the 8-function model. But at a conference, and I've been to every APTI conference since ages ago, I think it was 1980. And they, at this conference, David spoke, and he said, well, there are 2 variations of the 4 temperaments. One is those who are role directing in their communications, and another where they're role informing. And then he related it to the type code. So those who were role directing had either an N and J in their type code or an S and T in their type code. And those who had a preference for informing were N and P and S and TF. Got it. Okay. The map was in my head. So that's great. Next conference, 2 years later, David had always not really liked Jung's the definitions of extroversion and introversion. He didn't think they were really the heart of what it was. And he sort of rejected it. But he came back and he said, well, I did the directing, informing, initiating, respond. And then so he added initiating and responding. And initiating related in the type code to those with a preference for extroversion, and responding related to those with a preference for introversion. Now, very clearly, this is not about the whole of extroversion and introversion. Those are much richer concepts. And I don't believe that we're either extroverts or introverts. It's really a matter of what process do we lead, and is it dominant? Is it extrovert or introvert? But that's another story. So we played with that. I was doing at the time MBTI qualifying programs, a very rigorous program, very rigorous that we were doing. Lots of statistics, taught a lot. I covered temperament in there after, and then after we did the dichotomies and the temperament, we did this as a cross check, and I asked people, well, here's what directing and forming means. It means that you'd like to, you're more comfortable telling people what to do, less comfortable just giving information, and the opposite for informing is more comfortable telling people, just giving some information and waiting for them to act. And then I talked about initiating, responding, which was pretty easy. And I'd ask them to think about what fit them. And then I did this as a cross check for finding their best fit. And we put tape on the floor, the days when you can do an in-person workshop. We made a matrix on the floor, and I had people go stand where they thought they related to those two dimensions. And then I looked at people who were there, and by this time I would have spent like a couple of days with them and had a good sense of them. I started making up stories about what it looked like in turning to the which quadrant. And my colleagues, my co-facilitators, and I began to be convinced this was something separate. So we just found that stood on its own. And we made up names for them. They're not the best, but, they're just little, in charge, chart the course, behind the scenes, and get things going. And this is about energy patterns. And the directing and forming, those with the directing preference, chart the course, and in charge, have a time and task focus. And behind the scenes and get things going have a motivation focus. Now, it's not the task versus people, but it's a motivation. So it's about giving information and then leaving it up to you to act on it, because they want you to want to. It's a way to get buy-in.
You mentioned another model you kind of glossed over at the eight function model. And one of the things I wanted to ask you was, is it relevant to teach the eight function model, or, does it have value, or is it too complex? Like, how do you approach it?
Is it relevant to teach it? Yes. How you teach it is another story. So, my background is in the theory of living systems. David Kersey taught us about systems theory way, way back before it was popular. It came out from first in the context of family systems. And so a living system has several characteristics that I learned from Fritjof Capra, C-A-P-R-A, Fritjof, F-R-I-T-J-O-F. Okay, Fritjof Capra. And he said, if you want to understand any living system, you have to look at what is the pattern of the system. And then you can look at processes, and you can look at structure. So the pattern stays the same throughout our lifetime. All living systems have a pattern. And it's important to identify what are the essential qualities of that pattern. So that's what we were doing with interaction styles when we were developing. It's what we've done with essential motivators or Kersey's temperaments, using the targets, core needs, values, talents, behaviors. Those are essential qualities. Those things, they'll stay the same over a lifetime. And then there are processes, or activities that help maintain the pattern. And then there's structure. And the structure is the embodiment of the pattern. So we could say, at least based on some of Dario's work, that these patterns show up in patterns of use of the brain. And when Dario Nardi did his work, and initially, and it's still happening, it's always a pattern. It's never, it's this region of the brain.
Right.
It's a pattern of the kind of activity, not just where is it. The key thing about the eight function model is it's not about the functions. It's about the pattern. And so what John Beebe has done is described a pattern. And what we did early on with dominant, auxiliary, tertiary, and inferior was a pattern, maybe a little less accurate than John Beebe's, in my view. Some disagreement in the type community about say the attitude of the tertiary and the inferior, etc. And this is the crux of the big problem with the 8-function model, is that parts change, patterns don't. So processes change. So when I have people come to take our certification programs, there are several people, they're not interested in getting certified. They just want to go deep into the models. And many of them, several of them have been there because they haven't been able to figure out their type. And some of them have gone to a whole bunch of other experts and having trouble because they're trying to figure out their type by what process they're using. So if you start with saying, I'm an introverted thinker, which is not good language because that makes introverted thinking all of me, and it fixes it. So if I try to identify the processes I'm using, okay, so here I am. I have INTP preferences. Right. I'm a therapist by trade, a counselor, facilitator, very much into helping heal the pain of not being able to be who they are. And helping other people do that without labeling. Because once you label it, it's fixed in time.
Okay.
So you would not think that my pattern would be INTP preferences based on the work I do.
No.
And based on the way I approach things. If you had seen me when I was younger, it would have been very clear. Okay. But over the last maybe 20 years, or so, if you go into therapy training, for example, you get a lot of therapy and you have a lot of growth. And so there are some shifts. So the problem, in my view, is that if you're looking at processes as if they are parts and that you can add up the parts, you can't. So the disagreement about the attitude of the 3rd function, for example, I believe, is I'm looking at patterns stay the same. John Beebe is looking at patterns stay the same in living systems. And John Beebe is also very much into understanding living systems. If you're looking at that attitude based on what you see people using, and when you use it, it gets developed. You get skill in it. So that's that aspect of type development, is developing skill.
Right.
But when it's type development about where how much access and what's the quality of the process. So that, for example, INTP preferences, I grew up in a small town in Kansas, greatly influenced by that particular culture. But also feeling like I didn't belong. Typical of many women with INTP preferences. Okay, so I grew up with that, but nonetheless, I still was critical. And when I first entered the type community, I was critical. I was critiquing all the time. Of course, I wanted to improve things. But, that doesn't work very well if the first thing you tell to somebody is you're doing something wrong.
Right.
All right. So over the years, I've learned to do things slightly differently. And then my daughter has ENFJ preferences. We work closely together. I managed to have business colleagues with ENFJ preferences and ESFJ preferences. And I just seemed to be hanging out with those people with extroverted feeling preferences. And I got a lot of really good coaching.
That's an excellent answer. I have to think about that. Okay. Maybe
Nothing like a short answer from me.
Oh no, I didn't expect a short answer. I'd be upset if you gave me a short answer. In terms of types, you mentioned a couple different types that I guess would be surprising for an INTP to develop a good working relationship with, or even a long-term relationship with. But if you could, are there certain types that you either have taken a long time to understand, or simply are there any types that you still struggle with, like how to interact with them well?
Well, the biggest variable is development. So and I mean consciousness development, the ego development models. not the type development models. So what makes someone hard to work with is how much capacity do they have for perspective taking, and how much complexity can they handle. Okay,
That's
so
good. Yeah.
all right, so
I guess that probably makes sense for most types. So yeah, I mean, it's good that because it's about development. Like I used to say before I knew anything, like when I first started in type, I said, oh, ESFP would clearly be the hardest type to work with just because they're everything. They seem to be everything that I'm not. But as I met them and I realized like, oh, their function stack, if they're healthy in the same development level I'm at, they're actually great. I've had maybe some worse relationships with INTJs. So I think there's a little bit of that Dunning-Kruger effect that happens when you learn it and then you apply it instantly with zero experience, just like you take the book and then apply it to life.
right.
It didn't work. This is not really a political question, but if you're looking at the United States, which of the 8 cognitive functions do you believe is like most lacking?
Well, that's an almost impossible thing for me to answer.
No, it's not.
Well, John Beebe thinks it's introverted intuiting. And
I would agree.
I suspect that maybe it may be that given the history of the United States, I read a lot of historical romances taking place in Ireland or in Europe or in I don't know, Thailand, all kinds of places.
Yeah,
I think it's because I haven't been able to travel. So, but there is. I think that there is a theme in the mainstream culture in the United States that was very focused on tangible, concrete. We have a love affair with extroverted sensing, and we have a hate. We hate it. We dislike it. We, meaning the mainstream culture.
right.
I mean, if you watch what's on the television, you look at who gets paid the most.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the athletes, people,
entertainers,
the entertainers, people who are probably predominantly SFP, STP. I don't know what. A lot, at least whether that's their pattern, that's the behavior they're exhibiting. And I think we've been slow in the United States to recognize the more spiritual side of things.
Mm-hmm.
And so that and to not believe things that just comes out of nowhere.
Definitely, if you say corporate America would be STJ or TESI, if you combine those together, it seems to me that that's slowly breaking. I don't know if that's because some of those people that inherited certain traits that were more like bootstrap, work hard, stay in the same career for 30 years, retire when you're 65. That sounds like a very like SI mindset. This is the way it's been. This is how you retire. This is the American dream. But maybe there's a shift towards more. I feel like it's more in FI. Definitely F and N are getting more preferences in millennials, or maybe it's okay to be N and F in a public space now or in a corporate space. We might see a shift. That's just my point of view.
Well, I think there are several things really crucial about what does it take to build a business. And I think it also shows up with NTJ. You know, so you have to envision something and then you have to put structures in place to make it happen. And then you need something that, then you need things to sustain it. So I think it's over the life cycle of the development of various industries.
I have asked various variations of this question. Previously, I'd asked people if you were on a project team or creating a business or whatever project, which of the three other types, including you, would you choose for your team? But I think a better question, and I want to ask you this, is like if you're going on vacation with 3 other types, what 3 types are you choosing, and then why?
Well, that's assuming my husband wouldn't go with me because we have the same preferences. So
He's not invited.
yeah. So, well, I thought about that because to me, I have friends of lots of kinds. The woman I was on the phone with today, on Zoom today, ESFP preferences, living in Greece, but from Vienna. I would take her, hands down. Why? Because she knows how to manage all of the details, and it's really, I think, about improviser. And yeah, and just I was just thinking about tactics and logistics. And so I thought about that because I think any work team, any endeavor is going to involve the talents of the 4 essential motivators: strategy, tactics, logistics, and diplomacy.
Okay.
And so I thought, well, then there's me. That's strategy. It's not quite as refined as the ENTJ strategy, but it's still there.
Mm-hmm.
And logistics, I would probably choose hard choice between ISTJ and ISFJ.
I think couldn't ISFJ kind of go between both the what was the fourth thing you said? Diplomacy and
could
tactics
I was
or
just
logistics?
thinking, when I was looking at it, what might be missing, and then for diplomacy, it would be ENFJ probably, because you have to deal with a bunch of different people, and they would be a lot better at that probably. But part of it, if we're going on a vacation, there are several things we need to do for it to be successful. So we need to chart a course. So that's why I picked ISTJ.
Mm-hmm.
We need to have some get things going energy, which is my ESFP friend.
Yeah.
I'll do behind the scenes. And then we have the ENFJ who would be in charge, but gracefully in charge.
I did my first Association for Psychological Type speech for the Australian one, and it was about a young type coach's journey. And part of my basic thesis of my presentation was the convergence of new guard, old guard, passing the torch, Linda talking to Joe, and all this information that you have, and you've built this huge following and content and books, and what can we do to use that in a social media world where lots of content, at least from my age, is being consumed on LinkedIn, TikTok, Instagram, things like that. Can you talk about the relationship between the expert community and the influencer community? What are you seeing?
Well, I think one of the things I valued, I was at that conference, and it was the end, somebody, this couple that have made quite a living with podcasts and a variety of things, and have moved in my view, from influencer to expert. So there's a range, it's always a continuum. So the thing that bothers, and on this expert, there are the experts who teach the experts, which it turns out I happen to wind up being one. There's Roger Pierman, and there's a whole bunch of us who not only have had practices with organizations and individuals, but have furthered the body of knowledge and stuff. And then there are those who have had training, and they're practicing because they've had the training, very often in business organizations. There are people who consider themselves experts because they've had an MBTI training. And then there are people who consider themselves experts in other related fields, I suppose. And then, so it's more like a continuum. And so the thing that I noticed, and that my daughter harps on me a lot, you have to give away stuff for free. And that, to me, bothers me because there's a lot of work gone into it, and a lot of that work was not paid.
Sure.
Right. So there are two things I have. One is the concern that nothing should be intellectual property. and you don't deserve to have compensation for that. So that's one issue. And the other is, I forgot exactly what it was. It was something about having, feeling like they've taken one training or they've read one book or whatever, and then they have a sense of, what to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
So on the farther end of the influencers are people that take my trainings, who've also had MBTI training, who've also had several other trainings, and they're still learning from me.
Mm-hmm.
And they're coming to me. I don't know for sure why. I mean, I haven't even asked them, but they usually take all 3 courses. So we have a course per lens, a certification course,
Mm-hmm.
each about 9 to 10 weeks long.
Wow.
With 2 hours of homework, 2 hours of training a week. Now, do they all do their homework? No, but I just tried to make it more interactive by putting videos in the homework. So I think the biggest issue I have, besides the IP issue, is bias.
Okay.
So the biggest thing that I learned very early on is that David Kersey had a bias. He did not write very much about the stabilizer, the SJ pattern. He would have fewer pages. And then the improviser, he had the SP patterns. He brought some great gift to us to understand those, for example, is separate from, not the middle letters of the type code,
Mm-hmm.
but these essential motivators or temperament patterns, he called them. So he had these patterns that he described, but the examples he used in the improviser were the Wild West gunslinger.
Yeah.
Right? Practicing over and over. When I had permission to use his descriptions in my early work, so I would do a workshop, one with a government agency, I remember, and there's a guy who reported, I think, ISTJ, and he didn't really seem to mind that description. But I always felt like, so you go to someone in law enforcement and all he's describing are the lawbreakers. And then there was this stereotype of the lawmakers, which he would have called stabilizer, and the lawbreakers, which is, so a lot of my work is about how do we describe these patterns in a way that are not biased, that are fair. That's why I'm ready to do, the Essential Motivators booklet has some changes. And I just got feedback yesterday that when I say the stabilizer is authority-centered, that the younger generations aren't recognizing that. So anyway, there will be a 5.0 of the temperament booklet.
There you go.
Because it's about finding those biases, and the biases often come from the people that you've known and the various examples, and the developmental level, meaning that increased capacity for perspective taking and for thinking long term and to handling complexity, that increases in some people over age. And so it depends on where you take your sample, that when you're describing people. So what it's so easy. And I find that people who would be considered type experts sometimes, but have less experience, are not doing as we're all of us guilty of having bias in our descriptions and the things we say. But when somebody's learning something early on, just like a baby learning to talk, there's a dog, right? And he learns to say goggy, goggy, goggy. And there's a cat, and it's a goggy, goggy, and a rabbit, and it's a goggy, goggy. Because what he's learned is that a furry animal that's small is a goggy, right?
I see what you're getting at.
Yeah. So when we're learning something, very often we don't learn the full extent of it. And then when we go to describe it, we can describe it in a way that will put one down and be less. And I have one other thing to say.
Yeah.
I got this from David Kersey. Knowledge accrues to skill. In other words, the more we do, the more we use type to solve interpersonal issues, for example, the more we find ways to apply it, the greater our knowledge will be.
Yes. Well, Linda, thank you so much for being on the channel. I demand my audience adds you. I'll post this on LinkedIn too, so people can add you there. I appreciate the time, and hopefully we can talk again when the book comes out, your new book.
Thanks. Thank you so much for asking me. It was fun.
I tried to live without you. Just can't